Hello, Internet. Welcome to episode number 230 of the Comic Watchers Show. I'm your host, Matt. Chad is, he's not here yet, but Chad is on his way, we promise. I've got a very special guest tonight, though. We have got the one and only legendary Ron Marz. You know him from Green Lantern, Witchblade, my goodness, everything under the sun this man's had his hands in. And tonight, though, we're talking about the 30th anniversary of Zero Hour. So, Ron, welcome.
Hey, Matt. Good to see you again. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, brother. I appreciate you being able to make some time to fit us into your schedule. And I'm sure you're a busy guy, but taking time out to talk to nerds in the middle of Oklahoma is always nice for me.
Well, the only thing you're preventing me from doing is putting my studio back in shape because we had duct cleaners in today, and so stuff's everywhere. Stuff is more everywhere than usual, is what I would say.
So what you're saying is that you've got the typical or maybe stereotypical creative mind where things are just a bit of an organized chaos.
Yeah, maybe by the weekend things will get put back in place.
All right,
right now there's artist editions scattered all over the room, so we have to clean those up.
Right on. So, I mean, how have you been, man? Did you make it to San Diego? And if so, did you escape without COVID?
I did not make it to San Diego. Oh. I was in Raleigh, North Carolina instead for a GalaxyCon show.
Okay.
Where I did, in fact, pick up a dose of COVID.
Oh. Yeah, it's going to be with us for a while.
Yeah. Honestly, I, knock on wood, it was very mild. With that many people in that confined space, I kind of figured, well, it would be really dodging a bullet if I didn't. So sure. It was a 4-day show. Really great. GalaxyCon does a great job for its guests and attendees. But by the time I got back here Monday, I was like, well, I don't feel that great. But it ultimately turned out to be just kind of a case of the sniffles. And it took me to the weekend to start testing negative again, but I really didn't feel bad.
Well, that's good. That's good. And hey, here's the one and only Chad Burdett joining us from lovely upstate New York. Welcome, Chad.
Hey, how's it going?
He just wanted us to get the COVID conversation out of the way, and then he joined.
Yes. That was Chad's and my plan the entire time, was to stall. No, not really. Chad has really pinch hit in the driver's seat for me a lot in the last few months because I've had my own things going on, and I would be remiss if I did not repay the favor on occasion. So anyway, we're here. We're talking about the 0 Hour 30th anniversary special. It comes out in 2 weeks, August 28th, from DC. Of course, Ron, you yourself did not write or draw 0 Hour. That was, of course, Dan Jurgens. But your career is inextricably linked to it.
My career is inextricably linked to Dan Jurgens because he's the commissioner of our fantasy football league. So
that's actually pretty cool.
I have to play nice with Dan.
My understanding is he's one of the nicest people in the business. So that's
he's one of those Midwestern guys. He's one of those Minnesota Midwestern nice guys, and as much as I've tried to, pierce that facade, he's just a good dude. There isn't any deep dark waters in Dan Jurgens. He's just a great guy, and someone I've been friends with for decades. So, yeah. I mean, I didn't do 0 Hour, but I did do Emerald Twilight, and Emerald Twilight is sort of wrapped in this thing. As you know, it's Emerald Twilight's 30th anniversary, and it's the 0 Hour 30th anniversary because both of those books came out in '94. Okay. Emerald Twilight first, obviously, and then less than 6 months after Emerald Twilight, 0 Hour came out.
Yeah.
And I did, obviously the Green Lantern Zero issue was a big chunk of the 0 Hour story. Although at the time I did not know that Hal Jordan as Parallax was the big bad villain of 0 Hour.
Oh,
Like, editorial had forgotten to tell me this. Like literally forgot.
That seems rather relevant to the Green Lantern mythos and the guy writing.
So we ended up having a meeting about, here's what we need from you for the Zero issue, and it's what we talked about before, and it's going to be Kyle and Hal and Oa, and I'm like, I'm sorry, what? They're like, Kyle is going to fight Hal, and I'm like, Hal's in this? They're like, oh yeah, we told you that months ago, and I'm like, no, you didn't. We have not had this conversation. We're having it now for the first time. So I found out that Hal was the big Zero-Hour villain, like when I had to sit down and write the Zero issue of Green Lantern. Obviously, it all worked out okay.
Right.
And I was, happy to be that part of it. And then when Dan and I realized that it was the 30th anniversary of both Zero-Hour and Emerald Twilight, and certainly part of this stems from the anniversary specials that were done for the Death of and Return of Superman, which were really successful. I mean, they were good stories. They worked great, but they were also, successful sales wise. They sold a buttload of copies. I don't know if you guys know this, but publishers like to sell copies.
Absolutely.
So Dan and I started kicking around the idea of an Emerald Twilight and Zero-Hour special, either as two one shots or one big one. So we ended up with the one big one version of the story. Story was, essentially going to be the same either way.
Right.
But it was a great deal of fun. It was a chance to go revisit these characters in this era, or in essentially what is 90s era DC. And I can't tell you exactly how they're in 90s era DC because it's not a flashback story. It's set now.
Okay.
It's set now, and it stars Kyle Rayner as he is now. But we get to touch on a lot of what happened in the 90s and beyond with a lot of the other characters.
Right on. Hopefully, Wally West shows up as the Flash, and Aquaman has a harpoon for a hand. So,
while you can't do one of these big sort of cosmic crossover cataclysmic stories without the Flash.
Absolutely,
it's a necessary component. So, I don't think I'm spoiling anything by saying the Flash shows up really early on in the story, and it is in fact Wally West.
You gotta love it, because Barry was gone at that time, so that makes a lot of sense. So, how did it feel for you stepping back? I mean, I know you periodically revisit Kyle whenever you get the opportunity, or the opportunity is presented to you. But how did it feel to specifically step back in a way to your own career 30 years ago in writing this project, or co-authoring it, I should say?
I said this when I was doing the Surfer throwback stuff at Marvel. It's like putting on a well-worn pair of jeans and a hoodie that fits just right. These are very familiar. You're stretching familiar muscles. You're doing things, hopefully not in exactly the same way you did it 30 years ago, but you're touching on those characters again and utilizing the skills that you brought to it in the first place, but also everything you've learned in the years since.
Right.
And I understood the assignment. This is writing. This is me writing Kyle. So I do what I do. I wrote it. I wrote the Kyle pages of the story in much the same way that I would write any Kyle story, which means the story is very much told from his perspective. It's got a first person narration from his perspective because that's how I did virtually every issue of his that I wrote, and that feels right to me. That feels like the way that I want to tell these stories, and it also feels like the way that I think the audience is used to having these stories told to them.
Right on. Chad, why don't you jump in, bud?
Well, I just want to say that when I realized that it was the 30th anniversary for Zero Hour, I realized I was 16 and in high school at the time that it came out, and then I just kind of turned to dust.
Well,
Because
I mean,
it really doesn't seem like it was that
14,
long ago.
behind you.
I honestly wasn't that much older than you at the time. I mean, I broke into this business fairly early and inherited Green Lantern not long after. But yeah, I mean, in some ways, it doesn't feel like 30 years at all. I mean, in comics, nothing feels like 30 years because, if something happened, like deep in the past, it's like 3 years ago. You know, Batman's been 35 for like 70 years. So, time is a squishy thing in superhero comics anyway. But I think Dan and I came up with a story that allows us to have the story have a contemporary sensibility to it, and it's set in the here and now.
Mm-hmm.
But it allows us to reach out to a bunch of different touchstones that were very much 90s era characters, 90s era aspects of the story, and
Right.
and versions of these heroes that would have been seen shortly after Zero Hour or during Zero Hour, and some heroes that have evolved since then.
Right on. So if I'm hearing you right, anchoring it in modern storytelling sensibilities is how you have prevented it from being just an exercise in nostalgia.
Yeah, I mean it's look, nostalgia sells a lot of books.
Sure.
People aren't buying Ninja Turtles and GI Joe and Transformers because they just discovered them last year, right? That's not why those books sell big numbers right now. Everybody that's buying those books was 12 when they discovered them. So the nostalgia has its place, and in a lot of ways, nostalgia is part and parcel of what we do in superhero comics. But that doesn't by any means mean that it's all we should do. So yes, there's a nostalgia factor, but there's a where are these characters now factor. And I think hopefully, again, I don't want to give away too much of the story, but hopefully there's a slight wistful factor in the story of what could have been if certain things had worked out differently in the past.
Right.
So without giving away too much of how the story actually works, we're within the story, we're looking back at this era, and there are positives and negatives anytime you do that.
Right on. So tell us a little bit about your artistic collaborators on this book. Who do you have working on the art?
We got Murderers Row.
I assume Daryl Banks is in the house.
Daryl Banks is in the house. Daryl Banks is in the leadoff spot.
Absolutely, as it should be.
So we ended up. So this is an 80-page book. We ended up, and we probably started on it a little later than we would have liked to, because that's the nature of comics in general, is there's never enough time. So I remember we had our first real meeting about, yes, we're going to do this back in April. I was in New Zealand, so we had to coordinate. Like, I was in tomorrow because I was in New Zealand, and DC's editors, Brittany Holzer is our editor on this, and she is absolutely terrific. Is in LA. Dan is in Minnesota. So we had to coordinate all of that to have a meeting to sort of go over the ground rules of what we were going to do. So that's when we sort of settled on, okay, this is what we're doing, and here's how the story's going to break down, and that's when we decided, all right, in order to get this done and out by August, which was the goal, which was, DC said, we want this to be an August book. And I think Dan and I both went, you guys realize it's April now, right?
Yeah.
that's a lot of pages to get done between now and then. But that's sort of what usually happens in comics, is you never have quite enough time. And also, it's nice to include. So there was a necessity of bringing in a number of artists to work on this thing in terms of the schedule. But there was also, you want to have, you want to throw a big party and invite as many people as you can. So we ended up with, I believe this is in order, 10 pages from virtually everybody in this list. Daryl Banks is the first artist. Kelly Jones does the second chapter, which is will not shock you, as a Batman-oriented chapter. The third chapter is drawn by Tom Grummett with inks by Norm Rapmond, and that is more of a Superman-oriented chapter. The fourth chapter is drawn by Jerry Ordway. He's pretty good if you like that stuff.
I've heard he's all right.
There's some historical stuff in there that Jerry just sank his teeth into. And then Paul Pelletier did 10 pages. My former GL artist, along with Daryl, and to me, one of the underrated geniuses in the business. And Howard Porter, of the, for my money, probably the greatest JLA run ever.
Sure.
With Grant Morrison. And then some guy named Jurgens drew the last chapter.
Well, look at that.
Again, inked by Dan is actually inked by Brett Breeding from the Superman Glory days, and Paul Pelletier is inked by Norm Rapmond as well. So, and then the whole thing is colored by Alex Sinclair, which allowed us to really kind of pull everything together.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's a testament to not only the artists involved, but editorially, like, this is a heavy lift, having 7 different artists plus inkers plus colorists involved in a book, and everybody needs to sort of reference from other people, and this is what this graveyard is going to look like in Jerry's pages, but Paul's going to get to drawing it before Jerry starts his pages. So all of that stuff is a logistical hoop to jump through.
Sure.
Many hoops to jump through, in fact.
Many time zones.
So it's not the first rodeo for me or for Dan. So, we get it. But also all of the artists, obviously we reached out to artists who were very much of 90s vintage, shall we say, in terms of in the business, but also guys who are consummate professionals and who could handle this sort of assignment, where it's like, all right, well, I don't know what this building looks like, so I'm going to have to leave that out until the next guy gets to draw that. It's a referencing and logistical obstacle course to run, and thankfully, with the help of Brittany and her assistant Chris Rosa, the whole thing went together pretty seamlessly.
It must have, if you got it ready in, well, I guess really 3 months.
Yeah, I mean, it went to press. I believe it went to press the couple of days before San Diego. So we had that fly in the ointment too. It was like, oh, this book's got to go like Monday because San Diego's coming up and it's going to wreck everybody. So the book's been done for a bit, and I assume is probably in boxes right now. Usually you're printed a week or two out, and at some point a box of comps will show up here in the next few days, I think.
Awesome, very, very cool. Chad.
So, revisiting that era of the DC universe, what's the most 90s thing that you feel that you incorporated into the story?
Starman. I don't think that's given away too much. We wanted to make sure that Jack Knight had a place in it. And again, I don't think I'm giving away too much by saying that There is reference to Batman getting his back broken. There is reference to the death of Superman. Those are story aspects that we wanted to work in there, in addition to Emerald Twilight and Zero Hour as story fodder. It's, you know, given the cover to the book, I don't think it's a shock to anyone that Hal Jordan as Parallax is the villain of the whole story.
Right.
So it's I think it's a contemporary story, but it's got its roots back in those days.
Now, is this the first? This isn't the first time that, maybe I'm wrong, you have revisited the Zero Hour continuity. Did you do one of the books during when they were doing the Flashpoint stuff or something where they were like, oh, we have the characters? It was Convergence where they had like the different continuities fighting each other.
Right. I did a Justice League book in Convergence, and I did Batman and Robin in Convergence, and didn't really have much to do with Zero Hour in either of those. But not a dissimilar storytelling technique, right? This is a world threatening, universe threatening, really, event, and realities are getting squeezed. So this is not my first time squeezing reality, I guess is what I'm saying.
One of the things that stands out to me about Zero Hour from a narrative perspective is the heroes are really on their heels the whole time. I mean, until the end. Like, it's not like Crisis where they're constantly, okay, here's our plan. Oh, well, that didn't work. Here's our other plan. Oh, that didn't work. And so on and so forth. They're really just reacting throughout the course of those original 5 issues of Zero Hour. And I realize this might be more of a Dan Jurgens question, but is that sense of we're losing no matter what we do really permeated Zero Hour? I mean, did you give that sense at all when you wrote the special?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly losses in the story. There are, again, without giving away too much, there are losses and heroic sacrifices and a sense of sometimes what heroes are required to do is sacrifice themselves for the greater good. So that sensibility of we have no way to win this fight, but we're going to fight anyway, is very much shot through the pages, particularly the Jerry Ordway pages, without giving you too many specifics. The stuff that Jerry drew, and at times I felt a little bad about, Jerry, can you draw the entire Legion of Superheroes?
I feel like Jerry Ordway probably took that assignment and just ran with it.
He did. Jerry, okay, when you're done with the Legion of Superheroes, can you draw the entire Justice Society in 1940? The answer to that was also yes. So because of the nature of the story, we got to play in some different time streams and some different eras of DC continuity. There's some historical stuff in there. There are characters in here that I was just tickled that I got to write for one panel. So there's a not that we went through and said, oh, well, let's have a checklist, but to a certain extent, I had my own checklist and I made sure some stuff got in there that I wanted to write. So
speaking of that, I know that I think it was the Linear Men were, kind of pivotal at that time in Zero Hour. Do they make an appearance?
Well, that would be telling. But there are story elements and characters from the original Zero Hour series that make an appearance in this. And I think we did it all in a way that if you haven't read Zero Hour, this is not going to be Greek to you. This is an accessible story, and I think everything you need to know is present in the story. There are ways that there are narrative ways that we made sure that you, if you've never seen Zero Hour and have no idea what this is, this story should still make complete sense to you. If you read Zero Hour and you have that in your back pocket, the tapestry is probably a little richer because you get all the references. Mm-hmm. But we wanted to make sure that this wasn't just an homage to Zero Hour, where we're just filling out, just going down the checklist and
checking boxes and tooting
boxes. This is first and foremost a story, and it's very much a story that's told through Kyle. When Dan and I first started talking about it, I said, well, Kyle needs to be our point of view character, both in that we're going to pick him up where he is right now in DC continuity, but also that one of the reasons that Kyle is who he is as a character is that he was your point of view character. He is your everyman Peter Parker, Spider-Man type character where you get to see what's going on through his eyes. So as he's trying to understand what's going on and what he's been sucked into, you, the reader, are having that same experience. So as he learns stuff, as he understands what's happening, so do you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've always loved Kyle. Like he and Peter David's Aquaman were really my entry points into the broader DCU beyond Superman, Batman. Because, every kid that collects comics has a Superman or Batman comic in their collection somewhere. And beyond that, everybody knows who they are. But yeah, Kyle, I think you said it best, as being the Peter Parker type character was something that I really gravitated towards as a younger reader. And I feel like really gave a level of depth or a level of accessibility to the DCU that, at least at age 15, 16, I was a little intimidated by otherwise, because DC has lots of years of continuity.
And certainly that wasn't an accident. I mean, it was partially a plan of, this is a ground floor read. I don't think we ever discussed, well, let's make sure that this Green Lantern book is a way to get people into the DCU. Right. I don't think we ever had that discussion. It just sort of happened because we were introducing a new character and frankly, a more Marvel style character into the DCU. And a lot of people gravitated towards it because it was new and it was accessible. The other aspect of it is this was my first regular monthly at DC after having worked at Marvel for a number of years. So I wanted to go play with all the toys. I wanted to go explore the DCU and write Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and Shazam. Like I wanted to get my hands on all that stuff. So the first year or two of my run was very much me, trying to grow Kyle as a character, but also introduce him to this world that he had just been thrust into the greater DC universe, but also just let's go meet Batman, because that would be cool, because I want to read Batman.
Well, I always liked how they had, like, when Kyle first joined the Justice League, he was kind of like the new kid on the block and learning the ropes and kind of, asking permission to do stuff.
He was the POV character. He was the regular guy surrounded by gods. And I think that was a really useful narrative trope in that book, because it sort of at once it sort of grounded the book, because he was just a guy, but it also made the other heroes that much more iconic because he was just a guy and he was with Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman. I remember having lunch with our editors and Grant Morrison, and I think Mark Millar was at the table too, discussing, Justice League and discussing how Kyle worked in Justice League, and what role he played in the book. And, that was exactly it. It was the human perspective being thrust into the mix with all of these essentially godlike characters, and at the very least iconic characters. So it's a great fit. That was a book, even though my Green Lantern was in that book. I loved reading that book every month. It was the first one that came out of the comp box.
And then it also is also kind of the way they played him in the Justice League is that he was trying to atone for the sins of Hal Jordan, with his role as the new Green Lantern.
Oh, there was a lot to live up to, and which was obviously a big part of how I approach Kyle's story was he's got to measure up. He's the rookie who's been thrust into the starting lineup and in some ways batting cleanup, and you have to bear up under that. You have to prove yourself worthy.
Yeah. So how does it feel? It's been 30 years since Kyle and all of this. Like, just looking back, how do you feel? How proud do you feel? How do you wish there's anything you might have done differently or anything of that nature?
I'm not somebody who tends to look backward a whole lot, Matt. I'm proud of what we did, and I'm happy with what we did. Some stories turned out better than others. That's sort of the nature of monthly comics. Is sometimes you hit a home run, and sometimes it's a ground rule double, and sometimes you strike out. Sometimes you take one in the ear and you get hit by the pitch. It's just the nature of the business. But by and large, I'm really happy with. I did 7 years worth of Green Lantern stories in my initial run, and got to come back and do some more. But overall, I'm really happy with it. In large part because editorial kind of let us do what we wanted.
Sure.
There was not a huge amount of editorial control. There was, editorial oversight, of course, because you're playing with somebody else's toys. Even if you invented that toy, you're playing with somebody else's toys.
Right.
So, there was oversight, but there was rarely was there, you have to do this in this issue. They kind of let us find our own way. And certainly with Kyle, they let us make him up and just run with the kind of character that he was. There was not a lot of editorial direction. And there certainly wasn't any editorial dictate as to what kind of character he was going to be. For good or ill,
sure,
they trusted me. They trusted Daryl. They trusted Paul Pelletier. We just kind of cranked the book out month after month, and we're having a ball doing it. It's certainly back in the 90s. It was just comics.
Right.
They were not multimedia, multi-platform, multi-billion-dollar franchises as they are now, which is not a complaint by any means. The fact that our culture has become the world's culture in a lot of ways, is great. But it does have, once you are working on something that's worth billions of dollars, you got more people looking over your shoulder. So we kind of got away with more stuff than we probably would now.
Go ahead, Chad.
I was going to say, since you have this long history with the Kyle Rayner character, have you ever thought of if DC were to approach you and say, we want you to write Kyle's, ultimate swan song. Have you kind of given that any thought? I mean, without any like details or.
I really haven't, because it's not something I've been asked to do. It's not something that anybody's been asked to do. Superhero comics are by and large middle. There's an origin, and then there's years and decades of middle. You don't really get to the end of, if somebody tells you they're writing the last Batman story, they're lying, because there's going to be one next one. Yep. So that's the superhero comics, to a great extent, particularly, sort of Marvel and DC franchise superhero comics, are about the illusion of change. Things change, and people get interested, they get mad, they get excited, they get entranced by what's new. But Batman got his back broken and he's better now. Superman died and he got better too. And Kyle Rayner was the last Green Lantern forever and ever and ever, until he wasn't.
Now he's the torchbearer.
So it's, all of that stuff is the illusion of change. Permanent change very rarely happens in superhero comics, which is not, I'm not saying it's a bug. It's probably a feature. It's why we come back to these things month after month and year after year, because we want to see what we want to see where it happens. That's essentially what the job is.
Yeah,
is you want your job is to get the readers interested enough that they want to come back every month to see what happens.
Well, and I mean, to take your point of always being in the second act a little bit further, that also enables the next generation of readers an easier access point, because that torch is always passing, right?
Yeah, well, it's again, the job is to make sure that the readers you have are engaged, but also make sure that what you're doing is welcoming to a new generation of readers.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I'm 43 years old. I find stuff that I like, but they shouldn't be trying to cater to me. They need to be catering to my son, my daughter, right? Because they're the ones that are going to carry things forward in whatever that generation likes. I mean, assuming that it's well crafted, it's going to resonate.
Yeah, look, Chad and I go to the same comic book stores around here, and I will look at the racks of row upon row of new comics that just came out this week, and go, yeah, a bunch of those are not for me, and they shouldn't be. Right? You shouldn't be catering your line of books to middle-aged straight white guys who have been reading comics for 30 years. That's an aspect of what your audience is, and yes, give those dudes something to read too. Yeah. But it's that used to be the backbone of the industry, right? That's basically the only readers that we had. When I broke in 1990 and did my first few conventions back in those days, I mean, it was all dudes, one from one end of the building to the other. If there was a woman at the convention, she was either somebody's sister or lost. and then and that's what the publishers saw as their market, bunch of dudes. And fairly early on, I wondered, well, why don't we publish books for the other half of the world's population? And then why don't we publish books for different segments within those differing populations? And now I think we've 30 years later, we have arrived at a point where if there's a book for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely,
which is great. And it's not an accident that comics are more widespread now than they ever have been. Look, not everybody reads X-Men the way they did in the 80s when I was a kid. That's the book that literally everybody read X-Men. It was, I think it was legally required. And now that might have changed because of Gail Simone's #1 just coming out last week, but now everybody reads different stuff. If in those days, if you weren't keen on superheroes, you didn't have a lot of choices otherwise. Now if you're not keen on superheroes, you have a myriad of choices,
from the big two,
all genres, all styles. I think we're a much healthier industry for it because we are offering material that resonates with a much wider audience.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think the current best expression of what you just said is Ultimate X-Men. Like, that is not a book for me or you, or maybe it is for you. I don't know.
It's honestly, it's not
aimed at me remotely.
And I'm not sure like Ultimate Spider-Man is even for me. Sure. But
how easy would it have been to have just kind of taken the general concept of the X-Men, given it a little twist, and said, "Here you go, kids, Ultimate X-Men, Mark II." But they didn't. They hired Peach Momoko and said, "Go wild, just do what you do. We trust you." That's so awesome.
Yeah, and it's I think readers can tell when creators are just allowed to do what they do, right? And they have the trust of the publishers. And readers can tell when, editorials clamping down and saying, do it this way.
Yeah. For sure.
There's you can catch a whiff of that when you open the book.
Yeah.
And
have you read Amazing Spider-Man in the last few years? Don't answer that. Don't answer that. But yeah, totally. The art of allowing the creator to have their freedom, and I mean, you got to give the Image guys a lot of credit for normalizing that, right?
Right. Well, I mean, Image is certainly a different, a different economic model and a different ownership model and all that stuff. But the fact that we have that different model, and a bunch of other models where there's, creator participation, creator partial ownership, partial rights, there's any number of deals out there for you to make your book in whatever way fits how you want to conduct your creative life. None of that stuff existed 40 years ago.
Yeah.
When I broke into the business, it was 1990. I think I was 22 years old. Should have obviously been, much more nervous about writing Marvel comics than I was at 22. But being full of myself, I just jumped into the deep end of the pool. But those were, Marvel and DC, and to a great extent, a couple of very indie, Kamiko, and maybe Eclipse was still around, maybe First was still around a little bit at that, but there were very few options. You either broke in at Marvel or somehow found your way into one of those indie publishers, or you made your comic and Xeroxed it at the in the school office when nobody was looking.
Right.
Handing them out to your friends. There were no other options. Obviously now the playing field is wide open. You can make your comic and take it to any one of a few dozen publishers, including responsible actual book publishers, or kickstart it or put it online. There are no gatekeepers anymore in that sense. There are gatekeepers if you want to write Batman. You have to get permission to do that. The DC Comics frowns if you just put your own Batman comic book out.
Somebody did that. I don't remember who.
That's why they keep sending me those emails.
Yeah. And
cease and desist, Chad.
And, Marvel being owned by Disney, who is famously, of course, not litigious at all. Look, those have gatekeepers. You want to write Batman, you want to write Spider-Man. Well, that's a different equation. If you want to write comics, if you want to just make comics, nobody can stop you from making comics. You can tell any story you want to tell in a comic and put it out in front of the world. There's nobody to stop you. All it really requires is time and effort.
Right. Exactly.
So how have you feel that you've grown from when you first started, you know, writing professionally to now? Um, what have you learned, and what would you tell your younger self?
Um, I don't know. My younger self was pretty full of himself, so he probably wouldn't listen anyway. Um, I think you get better at it, and I think early in your career you're just so excited to be doing it, that you just sit down and do it. You don't know any better. Um, I think I'm actually a little bit. I mean, I should be better 30 years later, right? And I think I am. I've learned a lot by doing this. The best way to learn how to make comics is to make comics, and I've been doing that for a long time. So I should be better at it. But you also, the better you get at it, and the more educated you get at it, the more expertise you develop at it, the more self-critical you are because you know more. Um, it's kind of a conundrum in that you're better at what you do, but you second guess yourself a little bit more because you know more about what you're doing.
How do you balance that out?
Um, you just sit down and do the work. I mean, ultimately, that's what the job is, right? It's like, oh, it's not, oh, the muse did not land upon me today. I couldn't do any work. Monthly comics in particular are about ass and chair time. Get your ass in the chair and either write or draw however many pages you need to get done today to keep moving the ball forward. And the more you know about that process, the more you can, like, oh man, I'm not feeling it today, but I can, but you fall back on the tricks you've learned over the last few decades to produce it. I've never suffered from imposter syndrome or writer's block or any of that stuff. I realize I am extremely fortunate in that. That probably comes from the fact that I worked at a local newspaper from the time I was 18 when I was still in college. So that taught me to write on deadline, to write fairly quickly, to, you've got this much information and it's got to go in this kind of space. And you do that. You take that information and fill the space. That's not unlike writing monthly superhero comics. You've got this much of story. You've got this story to get done and you've got 20 pages to do it. Go. So it's a lot of it is, sit down and write, at least from the writing point of view. I can't draw to save my life, so I can't speak to that aspect of it. But from the writing side of things, you just have to sit down and do it and tell the story that you want to tell. Tell the story that you would want to read. That's the way I've approached this from day one, and still do it now. Like, what is the version of this story that interests me the most? I don't think about the audience or social media or any of those factors, or even honest to God, sales or fan reaction or anything. At its core, the job is to sit down and tell a story that you would be interested in reading.
Right.
Because the only audience that I'm 100% aware of the tastes and desires and all that is me. So I write a story that interests me, and I hope the audience comes along for the ride.
Well, I think an old adage that I really appreciate is, if you're bored writing it, they're going to be bored reading it.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, have you seen this before in this fashion? Is it a trope? Is it a cliche? If the answer is yes, do something else.
Yeah.
Don't when I edit stuff for people, or when I teach, I do some mentoring for different writers, different publishers. one of the questions I always end up asking is, have you seen this line of dialogue before? Oh yeah, they say it in X-Men all the time. Then don't write it. Nobody's interested in you imitating that. Come up with your own way to say, let's do this, people, because that's the worst line ever. That's not, if you, there's my writing tip for the night. If you ever write, let's do this, people, or God forbid, let's dance, start over. Nobody wants to.
Start over. Scrap it all.
So, are you currently working on anything else that you can talk about, or mention, or tease, or?
Some I can mention and some I can't. Obviously, my work on the Diablo franchise for Blizzard goes on, which is awesome, and I have a grand time doing it. And the expansion that we just finished will be out in a few months. The first expansion for Diablo 4. It's a great gig. It's different than comics, but it's still similar in that it's storytelling, it's visual storytelling, and character through dialogue and all that stuff. So there are a lot of similarities. Let's see. Well, I just got my copies of Savage Sword of Conan #4 literally today. This will also be out the same day that Zero Hour comes out. Weird, like both of my books coming out the same day. So I have an El Borak story in here, which is one of Robert E. Howard's first heroes.
Okay.
Kind of a proto Indiana Jones. Savage Sword 4 has El Borak by me and Mike Perkins.
Mike Perkins. Now there you go.
Exceptional artist and
absolutely,
and a friend for 25 years.
Beautiful.
So Mike had room in his schedule to draw this. So I'm doing more stuff for Savage Sword. I'm doing some other things that have not been announced yet, which I thought would be announced at San Diego, and we're not. So we'll
completing see. Sojourn.
Completing Sojourn is not on the list. I would do that. I would do that, but again,
probably some legal stuff, and
we're back to Disney being litigious because they own it. But there are the first cross-gen omnibus came out a few months ago. It was Sigil, which was a weird choice for the first omnibus, but okay. And I know the Mystic omnibus comes out September, October, or something like that. So the cross-gen stuff is finally being collected. Hopefully they'll do more. I don't know any more than you guys know at this point, because I did talk to the collected editions editor at Marvel, and they were like, "Yeah, we don't know. We'll see. We'll see how it sells." And the Marvel versus DC omnibuses are coming out in October too. And I wrote a bunch of stuff.
You have a piece of that action.
I wrote an afterword for the first volume, a forward for the second volume, a bunch of commentary for both volumes. Those books are monsters. I'm really happy with the way they came out. Particularly the Marvel versus DC, or the amalgam volume, which has Marvel versus DC and all the amalgam books, and other odds and ends. The back matter for that is about 200 pages.
I would imagine it has the Access miniseries in it that you wrote, right?
It's got the Access miniseries in it. It's got a bunch. It's got all the I think it's got all the amalgam cards in it. It's got the Marvel versus DC cards, which I wrote the card backs of. Nice. And I believe they have the fronts and the backs in the book. And there's a bunch of stuff that I pulled out of my files because I had a file of a lot of the material from that time. My notebook that I took notes in at the initial meeting at Mark Grunwald's apartment for Marvel versus DC. Like, I still had the notebook.
Wow.
So I sent all of that stuff out to DC for them to scan, and a bunch of it's included in the back of the book.
Oh, that's great. That is too cool.
So yeah, so I mean, there's literally like handwritten notes from me, and all of that stuff is kind of packed into the back of the book. It's a really impressive package.
I remember that being another big, event when I first kind of really started getting into reading and collecting comics.
Well, that was
I came in with Nightfall.
Well, all of that stuff was, that's the purpose, was to, particularly Marvel versus DC, was to get people back into comic shops, to get people reading comics again.
Yeah,
because the bottom had dropped out of the business through speculation. That early to mid 90s speculation boom, which was great if you were getting royalties on books in those days. But the bottom dropped out because people figured out that they couldn't take their copy of Death of Superman and sell it for $500 the week after they bought it. So all
the polybagged one I have is worth nothing.
Well, it's actually worth something at this point, because everybody whose mom threw their books out wants that book again. So
yeah,
all you got to do is find that dude, Chad. Somebody's that. But Marvel versus DC was designed to get people reading and get people into comic book stores, to keep the doors open at comic book stores. Nightfall was obviously a reaction to how well Death of Superman did, and Death of Superman was just a story. It was not like, oh, let's put together a story that will get all sorts of media attention and will sell millions of copies. It was just the next story that the Superman group was telling, and it blew up. According to certainly Mike Carlin, who was the Superman editor on those books and was also the Marvel versus DC editor. The fact that book came out on a slow news day and it got picked up by the news services and people lost their minds was what made that.
Sure.
So, thankfully we didn't get invaded by aliens or attacked by Russians the day that Superman came out. It actually got play in like national news media, and that's what spurred a lot of it. And then Superman dies, Batman gets his bat broken. You'll see Azrael in the 0 Hour special, frankly. Emerald Twilight was spurred by Death of Superman and by Batman getting his back broken. The only difference was that one wasn't going back to square one. That was a permanent one, or as permanent as anything gets in comics.
It was relatively permanent.
10 years is a good run, right?
10 years is a great run.
10 or 12 or whatever. That's a long time, especially, comparatively now where a long run on a book is a year or 2 years.
Oh yeah, definitely.
The industry has evolved in that sense, where most books, a lot of books don't make it to issue 25. They just get canceled and started again at 6 months later.
Yeah, if that. So, well, the pleasure is ours, Ron. It's been a whirlwind of fun with Kyle and us as readers, and your work in general, and not to mention Silver Surfer, Witchblade, and everybody else you got under the gun there too. So. Under your belt, I should say. So just really thank you for everything that you've brought to the table over the years.
Well, thanks. You guys have, prevented me from getting a real job for a long time.
That's what we're here to do.
That's still the goal.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, ultimately, whether I'm working in comics or video games, or obviously I'm working in both. The short version is I get paid to make up stuff, and that's just the best job going. If it's one of those jobs where if I get bored, it's my fault, nobody else's. So I make sure that I try to I try to stay ahead of the game, stay amusing myself, and everything else falls into place.
Well, let us hope that you never cease amusing yourself.
So good. I appreciate you guys having me on, and I appreciate
absolutely
to plug your. We had a great time doing it, and as with any project, the artists that you get to work with are the greatest gift that you can get. So the fact that I got to work with Daryl Banks, Kelly Jones, Tom. It's the first time I ever worked with Kelly Jones, which was such a treat. Tom Grummett, Jerry Ordway, Pelletier, Howard Porter, and then that Jorgens guy. Although Dan wrote the pages that Dan drew. So it was one of those let's get the band back together and put on a show kind of things, and hopefully the audience gets a kick out of it.
How do you not love it? The 0 Hour 30th Anniversary Special is on sale in comic shops everywhere, August 28th. Our guest tonight has been Ron Marz. Thank you, Ron, so much for stopping by and hanging out. And we're the Comic Watchers, and this is our show. We will be back next week. Chad, with who?
Kyle Starks.
Kyle Starks. He's coming at us. He's back. He's back for more. We must be doing something right. So until next time, thank you. Get out there, do something good in the world, because it can be an ugly place, but it doesn't have to be, and it starts with you. Thank you so very much. Until next time, we remain the Comic Watchers, and this is our show.